right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. We've got a rainy day out there today. So hopefully everybody's sitting at home comfortable with a coffee. So we decided, I'm Jess from Jaywalker and Pet Intel. And
I'm Jay, and I'm a nobody.
Oh, come on. And we've got...
No, I'm Jay with Coyote Canine Dog Training. And Natasha could not join us today, so it's just going to be me and Jess rocking it out.
Mm-hmm.
And we have some, what I think is some, I think at some point everybody struggles with this particular thing that we're going to be looking at in a very shortly here.
I know I struggle with it a little bit at home. So I think for a lot of people being at home where maybe it's becoming a little bit more prevalent, a little bit more obvious. And a lot of people deal with it regularly anyway. But this topic, sorry guys, the topic this morning is window barking and reactivity to all of the distractions outside in the environment. So I hope that we have people watching who are going to be able to use this for some of the information we're going to give you today.
Yeah, because there's a whole segue. It's not just about what's going on at the window. It's what's going on at the window and what that could potentially turn into.
Exactly.
And I think people will be, I think today, Jessica, I want to say that I think people are going to be quite surprised at how impactful the things are happening, and I want to say that, I mean, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus because I want to believe that everybody does their best. And so from that standpoint, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised at what goes on in the house, how much that impacts other areas of your dog ownership and how that looks. And whether it's a wee little dog or a giant dog.
Yeah, I think we're talking a little bit about relationship and how much you can influence how frequently this behavior happens and how your dog perceives its efforts, if that makes sense. So I think, should we just go ahead and I'm going to play this video that we have. I'm going to put the volume down because there's quite a lot of sound going on in the background of this video. So I'm going to turn it down quite a bit. I'm going to be playing this beside you guys there. So our video today, we have two little dogs in the video, or I guess one sort of medium-ish dog and a little dog. But as Jay said, I think it's really important to recognize this happens with dogs of all sizes, right? I have dogs that do this behavior. I definitely have worked with many dogs who have been displaying this behavior, and it doesn't always look like this, but it's important to recognize what the dog's motive behind the behavior is.
Mm-hmm.
So I talk a lot about motive in my day-to-day work with dogs, and I'm wondering what other people might be thinking the dog's motive here is. So if you're watching, please pop in and sort of give us an idea of what you think the motive might be behind some of these behaviors. So,
yeah, and these are super common things, and I think everybody struggles with this at some point in time, whether their dogs are puppies, littles like this little fella, small like the other little white fluff butt, or medium, large, or giant. It's something that everybody, I think at some point everybody has a big problem with. Unfortunately, it can be, I don't want to use the word fixed, I want to say resolved.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so going back to that motive here, looking. We've got somebody piping in who says that the motive might be that they're bored. And,
Mm.
I think boredom plays a lot into uh, these types of reactive behaviors. For sure, your dog is going to be a lot more reactive or on edge if they're bored. Um, but I think what's really important to see in this video, and we can go back a little bit and show you a couple of things, but I think what's really important to see in this video is that these dogs are alerting, these guys are alerting to stuff happening outside of the home. And what they typically do is watch that object disappear. It's not your fault necessarily, it's not their fault necessarily, but in their little minds, when they bark like that and the object keeps moving as it typically would if you were either on a walk or your dog is barking out a window, and the dogs bark and they react and they get all aroused and adrenalized, and then the thing disappears, we get like a hero complex because they go, ha, I've saved the day again. And you need to get them little superhero jackets because they think that they are effectively patrolling the environment and keeping everything at bay. Would you agree with that, Jay?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if we go back from the beginning, even I think the last week or the week before last, the second last live that we did, for me, when I see this kind of behavior, I try to look at the big picture more so than anything else. I mean, we know that there are people that are going to come in, and we know exactly what their go-to is going to be to fix this sort of stuff. And for me, that we could go off on a tangent about that, because that's a supply and demand type of thing. It's like people don't, this is the behavior I don't like. I want that fixed. That specific things, and we go, well, there's a much bigger picture here, and I don't necessarily want to fix one thing, because you and I both know how that's going to be fixed. And it's, anyway, without going too far down that
rabbit hole.
Yeah. I think that for me, I always look at the big picture. And are these dogs bored? Well, that could certainly be an aspect there, that the dogs are bored. But for me, I want to look at fulfillment again. And if we look at fulfillment, a lot of times, in my opinion and in my experience, I've seen you start boosting fulfillment. And even with littles, like this little fella and that small dog, there's no excuse for people to not be able to find an avenue to fulfill their dogs, whether it's a little or a giant breed. Littles are basically companions, but there's still an element of fulfillment that can be done there. I mean, we know Cher has works with littles, and so we know that how she goes about fulfilling them. So for me, I always look at this idea of fulfillment before I label the problem. Well, it's, the dog is bored. Rightfully, maybe the dog is bored, and this is a source of fulfillment and self-rewarding behavior for them. Makes them feel great. If we go down the path of just what's happening in the brain, these dogs are becoming dopamine addicts, and it's not a great equation there. So for me, I want to look at fulfillment, and because they're bored, but why?
Well, I think it's also really, that's a fantastic point, and I think it's also really important to look at. So little dogs, not all of them were bred to be companions. Like we've got this little guy on the screen here, that's a Yorkie. This is, that kind of a dog has a lot of tenacity. They were bred to do some pretty serious type work. So they're tough little guys, and a lot of the little dogs, especially the terrier type ones, they're tenacious and they're brave, very, very brave. And bravery combined with insecurity is by far, in my opinion, one of the hardest behaviors, because we're talking about a dog who's prepared to go forward because they're brave, not necessarily because they're what they get deemed as, which is like being, aggressive or assertive or dominant or any of those things. Most of the time, they're really insecure and they're saying, well, if this is the job I got to do, I will do it for you guys. And that's what I see here in this video is the owner. I don't know if you guys can hear it in the background, but we've got an owner who's really engaging these dogs and almost promoting the reactivity, like, what's out there, guys, what's out there, guys, and oh, you see something there, you see something there. So he's really engaging them. I see a little dog who first tries to grab a toy and kind of go, I need to de-arouse through my mouth. He redirects that energy to a toy, and he tries to do that. He's asking a ton of questions. This little Yorkie, he's asking a ton of questions. Okay, well, how do we deal with this? What should we do? So there's a lot of focus on, like, pay attention to the perimeter, pay attention to the perimeter. And going back to this idea of fulfillment, if you give a dog a job, whether or not it was an intentional gifting of a job, when you give them privilege, you also give them responsibility. And so a lot of these dogs will take those jobs seriously. They take it seriously and they do their best to do the job to fulfillment. And so that becomes the thing that they're doing to try and fulfill their drive and themselves. And we may not like the way that they do it, but they are doing their best with what it is that you've told them is how they should use those instincts and the outlet they should put them in.
Yeah, I think in this case, this guy didn't tell them what they could do. They just picked something up. He began to endorse it, and they went, "Oh, okay, this is what you want me to do."
Mm-hmm.
And whether they're little or giant, the same rule of thumb applies here.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I like how you hit on responsibility here. And for me, the reality is, you can't give a dog responsibility that it can't handle.
Well, you can. So, you just might not like what happens at the other end of it.
I mean, sure, you could if you. I mean, yes, you're right. You could give a dog a job a responsibility that it can't handle. Sure. In this case, what I meant was there's zero guidance here. Like, you want to be a protection dog, rock it out if you're a protection dog, but giving the responsibility to be that protection dog with no sort of boundaries or understanding of what you can do, what's socially acceptable and not socially acceptable, and how you can go about watching the perimeter in an effective way, not necessarily this excited, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not exactly sure how to do this. You know what I mean? For me, that's Absolutely. A little bit mushy, and that's where I think, again, the handler input is really, really causing conflict in these guys.
Oh, 100%.
You hear him, like at the beginning, endorsing the behavior. Who's out there? Who's out there? Who's out there? And his input, whether this person acknowledges it or not, is adding agitation to this equation. And these dogs are just getting more and more and more ramped up. A little bit later on, he goes in to play with this little Yorkie here, and the Yorkie wants nothing to do with it. But even further in the video, then he tries to shush them.
Mm-hmm. Which is really unfair, because at one point it just like switches, right? And I want to pipe in. We have a comment from from the same woman who had suggested maybe they were bored. She says, "My dog used to run off leash and meet other dogs. He didn't bark as much as he does now. I get him busy away from the window." And she has a lab collie mix. So, getting like the fulfillment, I think, is what she's trying to touch on. Like, if you have a dog who runs off leash, and I think it's really important to recognize here, though, that just because you have a dog who is social with other dogs off leash, does not mean that they won't engage in this type of behavior on leash or behind a gate or behind a fence or behind a wall or behind a window. The dog's reactivity on leash or behind a barrier is going to be 40 times higher than it is off leash. So it's coming from a different place. And what you've really done is that this guy, this little dog, has to really, really make himself loud. He doesn't have the ability to run out there and engage with the dog. So I think there's a semblance of frustration happening here too. These guys might actually be really social with other dogs off leash. I don't know. It's certain this behavior wouldn't eliminate that possibility for me in my mind.
Yeah. So I think for me, if I look at both dogs, that Yorkie I think is still a puppy, and the other dog I don't think is a puppy. It's a little bit older, and that guy is an instigator, or that dog is a catalyst to teaching this Yorkie some really annoying behaviors. Because I think that little Yorkie, look, I work with a pack all the time. You have 4, I have 6. Over the years of watching dogs, I think that dogs can learn socially, just like people.
Oh,
so
yeah.
meaning sometimes you have people who excel at academia, and they learn 100% through textbooks. And then you have on the flip side of that, which is fine. Then you have on the other flip side of that, you have people who have a good sense of what's going on and whatever they're learning in the textbook, but you place them in a social setting where there's a chance for dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly those little moments that might have been unclear, they're like, oh, okay, that makes so much sense. And I am of the opinion that the dogs tend to learn that way too. And for me, this little Yorkie is learning is learning socially by his buddy, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
Because nobody's there going, he's picking up all these bad habits from the other dog. And now this person, not only does he have an annoying fluffy dog there, I can't even tell
like a Lhasa mix maybe or something.
A Lhasa maybe or something. Anyway, but that little Yorkie, that would drive me absolutely bonkers. Wow. Hearing that every time.
I think that this guy is in for a little surprise, because the tenacity in which his Lhasa, if you watch the Lhasa staring out the window, he watches, he barks a bit, he paces a bit, he stares. The Yorkie is a different type of a dog. So if you start to promote this behavior, so he may have learned from the Lhasa that there's something to be upset about out there. But the owner could very quickly and easily, I think, with this little guy, because he's asking so many questions. He keeps looking back at him. There's so many question marks happening in his body, and he's offering a plethora of other behaviors. He goes to get his toy. He walks away from the window. He gets on the couch. He gets off the couch. He does all these things. He circles. You see adrenalized responses where he scratches his body. So there's so many times where he actually offers something that I would consider to be appropriate, and also where he asks a question, what should I do about this? And nobody gives him that direction, so his only default, and like you said, especially if he is a puppy, is to look back at the Lhasa, who's still staring out the window. And so he goes back to the window. Like he knows he should do something, but it's also a lot of stress and pressure to put on a dog. And this, to me, is very much an environmental space issue, because the dog is how the dog perceives the relationship with how space is accessed, who is going to grant permission and control access to that space, and who's in charge of patrolling it and reporting about what's happening on the outside. You're giving these dogs, this guy is giving these dogs the responsibility for all of them. You can access the space freely. You are in charge of granting permission and controlling what happens out there, and I need you to patrol and report about it. And that's a huge amount of stress and responsibility and anxiety compiled with now, probably at some point this is going to get really annoying, and you hear him go, shush, 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 which probably eventually it's going to turn into stop that. And now the dog is going to be getting reprimanded for a behavior that's been reinforced, and you've told them that that's what you want. So that it becomes incredibly unfair.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was just thinking about how unfair that is because, like you said, this guy is giving these dogs all of this responsibility that for me they clearly cannot handle. There's zero leadership in this equation whatsoever. And, whether it doesn't matter to me what the dog is, from a little to a giant, there's still leadership skills from the handler, like handler input.
Yes.
That needs to do this equation.
Yes.
Because it's clear that these dogs require that, and not getting it. It's like not doing something is still doing something. It's doing the wrong thing.
That's right.
So whether if you don't know what to do, if this guy clearly there's some confusion as to what to do here. So in my mind, if you don't know what to do, not doing something is just endorsing something that you don't want.
It's just as bad almost. Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, these dogs are going to continue doing this, and then somebody's going to come in with an interrupter. Like maybe that person's going to come in with an interrupter, or call somebody who's not going to do like you or I and go, okay, let's look at the whole equation here. We've got a leadership breakdown. We've got lack of response, like helping these dogs be responsible with whether their inherent traits or whatever space that they're given, permission to do this, permission to do that.
Yep.
What's okay, what's
an
not
appropriate
okay.
outlet and all that stuff.
They're not seeking out a person like you or I or some others that we know that are going to look at the whole picture and start from ground zero. They're going to go, my dog is barking and I don't like it. And somebody's going to go in with a huge punitive measure to shut the dogs up. And we know look, at the end of the day, maybe that'll work. For me,
it might work, but it's not necessarily fair.
The emotional well-being of the dog. From the beginning, but more to the point, it's so unfair in what's acceptable, and for me, that unfairness can really lead to a dog's confidence and spirit being broken when somebody comes and goes, "Hey, you can't do that anymore." And it's like, holy.
Yeah.
Crap! What do you mean? I've been doing this for years, or I've been doing this for months, and now suddenly I can't do this anymore. And
right.
That is such a breakdown in the relationship between the handler and the dogs. And it's, whereas if they just approached it from a way where things were clear and what was not okay was addressed early on, where the dog's brains are so malleable. And you could do it really effectively.
Yes.
And have a platform, a base to work from, so that you could easily address this kind of stuff is a much fairer way to go.
So we have somebody piped in and said, "What about closing the blinds?"
Well, sure. I mean, you're restricting access. You're restricting visual access. Yes. I mean.
So can I jump in on that? Because I think for me, like, closing the blinds is a no-brainer as far as management is concerned. The very first thing when you want to stop a behavior from happening is to stop a behavior from happening. And, the very first thing when you have an unwanted behavior is don't let them practice. Don't let them practice the behavior. So, yes, absolutely, you could close the blinds here. What I want to make sure everybody understands is that won't teach them what to do when they do see something.
Yeah,
but it will keep them from reacting when you cannot teach. So that's what I want to put out there. I always insist that people use management. Use it. Use management. Oh my gosh, please. We put babies and toddlers in cribs and playpens. Like, you can't always be on. So that's okay. So close the blinds if you cannot teach, but I think that's where Joe was going to go with it, is like, it's not going to stop them. It's not going to teach them what to do when. So you still have to set it up. There are times where you have to teach and tell them what it is that you would like them to do instead. And I think that's kind of where we're getting at, is like, if you haven't taught them what to do instead, what should I do when I see a dog on our front lawn? How would you like me to handle that? And when we continue to say, um, yeah, go ahead and do that, or if we get angry, a lot of the time our frustration and anger about their behavior in their brains connects to what they're seeing. So that's something I want to make sure people understand, because sometimes when we go over there and we yell at our dogs, we're actually just barking with our dogs. So the dog then starts to go, oh, I saw something and I thought it was upsetting, and you're now also upset, so it must have absolutely been upset, and let's now get upset together until it disappears. And then there's this huge when it goes away.
Yeah, you know what, Jess? Well, three things. One, I never. No, it's not that I never. It depends on what the behavior is. I think sometimes, and we might be repeating ourselves a little bit from a few podcasts ago, and that is talking about extinction bursts. At some point, you ignore what the dog is doing, and then it tries harder until it goes, okay, well, this isn't working anymore, and that can be a short amount of time, like it can be a very long time. Mm-hmm. So I think that I think that one, ignoring it for me in this case would not be an option.
Because it's going to be reinforced. That's why. It's because in this context, ignoring the behavior, if you ignore it and they continue to watch it disappear, it's reinforced. So
again, not doing anything is doing something, and in this case, it would be engaged in endorsing it. The other thing too is, yes, you could close the blinds, and out of sight, out of mind, I think is what people will resonate with there. You take the visual away, and you can certainly, what you can't teach, you manage. Mm-hmm. And so there's that aspect. But thinking that that's going to solve all the problems, no, I don't think that's something reasonable to expect. Mm-hmm. For me, when I've got 4 large dogs. 3 of them are protection dogs, and I think we come at it from a different perspective, and that is, yes, when you start to yell at your dog, sometimes it can be perceived as you're just yelling with them, and it endorses the behavior. But for me, from a leadership perspective, when my dogs see something, and it doesn't matter what it is, it might be, I don't know, it could be anything, and they, being the protection dogs that they are, they start to alert bark. I'm mindful of how much alert barking that is permissible, and 2, when I go, hey, knock it off, they go, okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm not barking with them. Mm-hmm. I'm giving an instruction. Mm-hmm. Thank you for alerting me. That's good. Let's chill out. I know what's there. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. And so I'm not, and you know what, Jess, to be honest, I can't really explain that. And I know 100% what you mean in terms of people yell at their dogs and the dog's like, yeah, we're going to get them together. And there's definitely that aspect.
I think I can explain it.
From the other side, hang on, I struggle with the words to describe how I can say, okay, that's enough, or guys, knock it off, or the Kai, Aspen, and Annabelle will line up at my window and go, bark, bark, there's a dog out there, and I go, yep, we're good, thanks, lie down or place, or don't worry about it. Again, it's there's so many nuances in that word leadership when it comes to dealing with this sort of thing. That's right. I don't have you need to do this, because for me, part of the equation is not necessarily doing, it's a part of being. Mm-hmm. And that's what I personally really have a trouble describing.
Well, and I
sometimes.
think so to break it down into a really clear, I mean, I have some pretty basic rules about implementing some sort of punitive, like, and a reprimand, like, hey, knock it off. That is a reprimand. It's a punitive. They went, oh shit, I shouldn't do that. But
Well, that depends on how that's conditioned.
it is so totally depends on that. But typically, the average person would say, stop that. And
Yeah.
I think the big point here is that do your dogs know what to do instead?
Hmm.
If they understand what they are supposed to do, dogs will still make mistakes. Even if you know the right thing to do, as a human, as a dog, whatever, even if you know the right thing to do, sometimes you make a mistake. And in that context, for somebody to go, don't do that, you go, oh, crap, you're right. I shouldn't do that. And so,
Yeah.
in that context, and it also depends on who's delivering that reprimand. If there's trust and an established relationship with the individual who is
Yeah.
delivering the reprimand, and you have been taught what the alternative is, then it serves as a reminder to not engage, as a reminder. So I think that that's the difference, is that if you have never taught your dog the alternative behavior, and if you haven't established a trusting relationship where your dog believes and understands fully that you can keep them safe and keep the environment safe, you will be struggling, you will be going against the grain, and what they will see you as when you start to engage in a reprimand is that you are now upset about what's happening outside. So there's a difference. And it really comes down to, again, going back to strengthening a relationship of trust and leadership, establishing your role, their role in the house, and then on top of that, delivering skills, alternative skills. So, like you, like my dogs, especially right now, because no one is anywhere outside, and then all of a sudden someone will come to my door to deliver a package. And try as I might to say, please don't ring the bell on any Uber Eats I'm getting or whatever it is, they always put the package there and ring the bell. And so, out of nowhere, and I have guys like dogs, usually when I'm working, they're tethered and resting. So out of nowhere they go, whoa, and then they say something's there. And especially from my big boy, my American bulldog here, he goes whoa, 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 whoa. It sounds terrifying. Um, but that's his way of going, that alarm me, that alert me, I'm on, I can help you. And then all I have to do is like, thank you, Poe. It's okay. Mind your business.
Yeah.
Like, and I say those words not because he necessarily knows what they mean, but because it reminds me I'm not angry at you for telling me something's there. Thank you for letting me know. And you said the same thing too when you were talking about addressing your dogs. You're like, thanks for letting me know. And I think that's something that my mentor, Cheryl Smith, I loved that she always thanked her dogs when they would do something like this, because it's like, yeah, thank you. Someone's at the door. I got it from here. And I thought that that was such a great way of reminding yourself that you're not ticked off, because it's easy, especially like I had babies at home who had just gone down for a nap and the dog would bark. I was angry, right? So I had to remind myself, thank you, because I'm like, oh my God, you're going to wake up the baby. But I was still in that like teaching mode. That's not your business. It's okay that a leaf fell from the tree. So now we're talking a little bit about that threshold. Like these guys in the video are barking because there's like a dog on their front lawn. Well, I mean, that's tough, especially if that doesn't happen very often, that there's a
Yeah.
dog on your front lawn. But some dogs are so sensitive that it could be like a high wind or a leaf falling from the tree, you know? But you have to
Yeah.
teach alternative.
I think for me, I think we agree on that. I mean, first of all, I mean, I sort of feel, well, not that I sort of feel,
Oh my
it's
goodness.
important to address
Sorry,
the person who commented.
I missed a couple of comments here. I just realized that they're coming in. I had to scroll down.
Yeah, my iPad totally died.
Oh, okay.
So I have no access. I have no idea who's talking. So
okay, so actually, my mom, who runs the sanctuaries, piped in and she said, "With such an open concept home, the blinds provide the only visual physical barrier as I see it." starting by removing the stimuli and then work from a less intense or frequent reaction to being the counter to begin the counter conditioning and training. Does that make sense? So, open concept home. Yes, the blinds do that. Remove the stimuli, work from a less intense or frequent reaction to begin the counter conditioning. So I think she's describing teaching at a lower level and building up.
Yeah, maybe under threshold stuff.
Under threshold stuff. So I think we were kind of getting there, right, when we were talking about the difference of the leaf falling from the tree or a dog on your front lawn.
Yeah. So to the person who asked, what can we do in a situation like this? And we threw around some concepts, and I've also learned over time working with a variety of different clients. You know as well as I do that you can communicate to people and it's just bang, you just get it. They get it. And in other people, you explain it and you have to explain it potentially 3 or 4 different ways for the lights to, well, not for the lights to go on, but for it to
the bingo
resonate
moment.
with them.
Yep.
And so for me, I teach by concept. So that's it's not bad, but it's a limitation on my part because I teach in concept. So it's always like big picture stuff. Whereas other people excel at teaching practical. They break it down 100%. Do this, do that, do this, do that. And for me, it's not necessarily about do's and don'ts. It's something really, it's like nailing Jello to a wall. It still moves around. It's not necessarily fixed. And so to address the person who was suggesting earlier, what can we do? Well, if I try to break it down in a super practical way, and I would start with, for sure, helping the dog understand, like putting in a solid marker system. So the dog understands what is good and it gets rewarded for. What sort of, oops, you got that wrong, or nope, that's not what I'm looking for. So marker system to tell the dog, yes, I like what you're doing. I would like you good. I would like you to keep doing that. And no, I'm not really looking for that. And then for me, I usually put break in there, or sometimes other people use free, which allows the dog to, that's basically you work 9 to 5, you get a lunch break. And at noon, you go for lunch, and that's your time. But you still have to use that time responsibly. And then second, I guess I would probably put in some reasonable obedience. And not that obedience for me is the be-all and end-all to behavior modification, but I think it offers a platform by which people can work in starting the alternative behaviors to barking out through a window. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean sit. Because I don't love the static behaviors as alternatives necessarily, because I think there's some value in the dog moving. So for me, recall is a big one, because I feel like I can teach the dog, you're feeling, you're at this stimulus right here, you know what, here's an alternative behavior that you're going to feel great about doing, and that also the underpinnings of that is teaching you that you can walk away from that particular thing that's making you feel uncomfortable or driving you nuts, and that's recall. And then recall and maybe a bed command in order to put it to address sort of state of mind stuff. Yes, I don't love what you're doing barking at the window. Thanks for alerting me. Come over here. Why don't you lie down and stay with me for a second while that thing does that out there?
So Christine's
those are for me some fundamentals that can.
So Christine just popped in and said, if the dog has a good relationship with the owner, to trust in the owner's guidance, they have a good enough understanding and respect to listen to the owner when told what to do. And she put a question mark there. And I see that Jane's already responded to her saying, I think that works well in those one-on-one situations, but she has 10 dogs. So Jane has 10 dogs. That's my mom. And they bark at once, and the pack reaction sets in much harder and to be heard. So I think we were kind of talking about that pack stuff. We've talked about that before, you and I, Jay, about the pack stuff and how we can use the pack to our benefit or our detriment. In this specific video, I feel like the pack mentalities, there's only 2 of them, but that's still pack, and I feel like that's being used in a detriment. Going back to what you were talking about alternative behaviors, I wanted to address that because I 100% agree with you about making sure that the alternative behavior that you're trying to implement also provides the dog the release for that adrenalized state. Because if
Yeah.
you and you can, I'm not going to say you can't, you absolutely can train a dog to come away and sit. And what you get is this: I'm sitting, and I am not comfortable with teaching a dog to be in a specific body position if it means that their mind is not healthy.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, you and I both agree on that. Like, obedience has a
Yeah.
place and it can be very helpful. But these dogs, I don't think, going back to what Jane said about, having to go to the lower levels and stuff like that, I gotta tell you, looking at these dogs with the amount of questions that they're asking, it would be, and they're probably food motivated. The little terrier, little Yorkie, is obviously toy motivated. He's gone back to his toy several times. All that owner would likely have to do to interrupt this behavior and to redirect it to something more appropriate would be to pick up that toy and throw it to the other side of the house. I
Yeah.
mean, to be quite honest, this is so simple. And in sending that message, you're like, thanks for letting me know. Come over here. Let's do something different. And
Yeah.
then you interrupt it. By the time that dog, you've played, you've given them, okay, you're paying attention to me. The dog wants to engage with the owner. You can see he keeps looking at the owner, keeps looking at the owner. If you engage that dog, by the time he goes back to check the front door, there'll be nothing there anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, I don't even know, we can work to the best of our ability under threshold. And just for people listening, threshold is like that level where the dog can no longer do what we would like them to do. They go over a certain level of adrenaline. We can do our best to try not to have a dog go over threshold. But this dude didn't plan for the dog to come walking on his front lawn. So stuff happens, regardless of whether or not you had plans, right?
Yeah.
What's super important when it does happen is to bring them back down to planet Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, the threshold is a very tricky, I just want to call it a thing. It's a very tricky thing. Because, if any, there's something out there called BAT 2.0, and that, I mean, you work under threshold. At some point, I'm of the opinion that I'm of the persuasion that at some point you have to breach a threshold to keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that it be done in a punitive way to breach that threshold. I'm saying you work in and you develop this idea in the dog's brain that the skill level is very high, that it can accomplish something very easily. And then you move past that particular, I want to say, like, line in the sand.
Difficulty level.
You just,
yeah,
sure. Difficulty level is a good way to put it. And you develop in the dog a better skill set to deal as whatever is bothering it is coming closer. So under threshold is really kind of tricky for me. I still think that people need to, I still just think that people need to, that the dogs and the people need to work past a particular threshold.
We've got another comment here.
Also, just you define threshold in a way that is interesting. For me, threshold is emotions go up, intellect goes down. You're way above threshold because the dog is no longer able to think and make responsible, good choices because it's all about the emotions and how it's feeling. And an easy way for me to give an example of that is using men and women, boyfriend and boyfriend, whatever your couple looks like. It's like at some point, people have disagreements, and it's in those disagreements where somebody might say something a little bit untoward, and it upsets the other person, and that person strikes back. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's emotions have gone up, and intellect has gone down. Why? Yeah. Because 9 times out of 10, the person who's lashed out or the argument that's happened, those two people will come back together and apologize.
Well, I always
because they just weren't thinking through.
And I always had a funny little saying that I used to use all the time. I forgot it until you just said that, but I always used to tell my clients, we don't negotiate with terrorists, with toddlers, or terriers. Because, we like, as soon as you start to try and negotiate with a mind that's unstable, you're already losing. So we've got a comment here that says, do you think that there's a possibility that by creating an alternative activity like throwing the toy, could potentially create a situation where the dog begins to bark at nothing to solicit the play portion of that pattern? And I think that's, look, I've seen that happen 1,000 times. Like, let's use window barking as a great example, also counter surfing. So if you start to really pay attention to your dog when they're doing things that are disruptive, okay, eventually you can chain those behaviors. Like she's saying, I bark out the window, the owner throws the toy. So what I think is really important in this pattern to break it apart is that we make sure that you're not just throwing the toy for them when they bark. You're saying, hey, thank you, come away from here, rewarding them for coming away, and then engaging in a different activity. So it can't just be the dog barks, you throw the toy for them. The dog barks at the window, you throw the toy for them, because timing is everything, right? We have 1 to 2 seconds to reward or punish behavior. So we want to make sure that that the dog is being called away and you're acknowledging the moment when that dog broke their attention out the window and redirected their attention to you. And then it's secondary to provide them with an alternative behavior. I know you're thinking hard about this, so you must be really...
Yeah, because I like, it's such a, like, I don't know who asked that, but that it's one of those questions for me that is very defining.
Mm-hmm.
Because it defines the difference between you being sort of considered as a plaything and a leader. And in that small nuanced thing, I'm gonna use a big word here. Post-reinforcement delay is key. And that means post-reinforcement delay is that you're waiting a particular period to reward a dog for a behavior that it's doing correctly. So in this case, if I use post-reinforcement delay in the way that I understand it is, the dog does, the dog barks and you say thank you, and then maybe you solicit the dog to come over, and there's a slight delay, 1 or 2 seconds, and it's given the reward. And for me, that is key, because it's not, I'm barking, then the toy gets thrown and I go get it. Because that's when the incorrect behavior is going to be changed to something good.
Ooh,
right? I bark at the window, then the toy gets thrown. And for me, that's not okay. And so that, I think for there, that's where you ask for the alternative behavior, it's rewarded then. So maybe the way that I've explained it is slightly incorrect in the sense in the post-reinforcement delay. I guess what I really want to say is there needs to be a delay between you putting in the alternative behavior, interrupting what you don't like, and putting in the alternative behavior.
Okay.
That needs to happen. Jess, you're looking awfully confused, and it's because in my mind I'm slightly confused.
No, I think
so.
I think it's because
I just want to be clear. I like the question so much that I'm obsessing about it, because it's just, I'm going to write that down after this live. I'm going to write that down because it's such a great question. So,
and I feel like even after this live,
I wouldn't pick up the toy and launch it just like that. That's not what I would do. There would be a slight delay between the launching of the toy and the behavior that I don't like, and the in between is where I'm going to solicit the alternative behavior. Bark, bark, bark. Come over here. Good. Whip the toy. That's probably the way that I would approach that.
So that was my mom that asked that question. She's provoking us. She's poking
Yeah,
us, and she's
yeah.
no
Well,
slouch. So I will tell you, she's that these are good questions, but um, I really want to address this because as you were going on and talking about this, like I wrote a handout about this because I had this same moment where I was like, oh my God, like, yeah, you're right, and timing and this, and you trying to figure it all out. And the way that I hammered it out in my mind is that there are three ways to make any behavior more difficult, which is that distance, distraction, duration. So if we're talking
sure.
about, timing is everything. You have 1 to 2 seconds to reward or punish behavior, okay? But your reward levels can be different.
Yeah,
So, what I would say is that if the first part of that, you have to break down a behavior, and so in this behavior, you're barking at the window. What do we want you to do? Disengage with the window. Pay attention to me. So the
yeah,
first thing is if that dog can turn its face for 1 second away from me, and at the beginning, you might go, "Oh, you turned your face. I throw a toy." So I would be okay with that, as long as the next time, once that's easy, the next time it's you have to look at me and now walk towards me. And then as that becomes easy, you have to look at me, walk over to me, and maintain eye contact for 5 or 6 seconds. And so the difference between using a toy or using a treat, it doesn't really matter to me. You can use
yeah,
the toy, you can use the treat, it doesn't really matter. Whatever's high value reward for that dog. But what's really important, so the dog doesn't start to train you, is that you are increasing the difficulty level using those 3Ds, and you are continuing to increase the difficulty level, but that you're always marking the moment that the dog hits the level you want them to be at. So
yeah,
what's the big thing is, like you were talking about, that in between. The big thing is marking the actual behavior of redirecting attention, not marking the behavior of barking out the window, because then barking out the
gotcha.
window becomes the behavior we're rewarding. So there is a nuance. Are you marking the dog turning away from the window and walking towards you, or are you marking the dog barking out the window? And I've had so many people remove those bells from their back door because the dog learned ding, 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 ding when no one's paying attention, right? Because then every time the dog rang those bells, they would come over and interact with the dog, and they would go over and open the door, and then the dog was like, I don't actually need to go outside, I just wanted you to look at me. And so so I had to, like, okay, let's get rid of them. So there's a nuance there of what are you marking, what behavior are you marking. And
Yeah. And you talked about the 3Ds there, and
yeah,
that whole equation about working up to a particular not working up to developing a skill set in the dog's mind. First, it's just looking, and then it's looking away for maybe a longer period. Then it's looking, coming towards you, holding your attention for, and those are the painstaking steps
yes, yes.
that are required in behavior modification.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there's so much success for putting in punishers first, because you don't have to do any work.
Yeah. We've got
Bang,
another comment
knock
here.
out.
Can the reward not be simply checking out the window, acknowledging they've done a good job? It's all done, and then there's affection, praise, and expectation to return to the previous household activities. So I think that's kind of what you were talking about.
Yeah, yeah. But I think what I wanted to just insert a word into that was, that's what working thresholds look like. You set it to basic, a good, better, best, or a beginner, not beginner, intermediate, pro. Like, it's always about those skill levels and where the dog is at. If you go too quickly, you're asking a beginner to do a pro skill.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to happen. So ask a beginner to do a beginner behavior. Ask a novice to do a novice behavior. Ask a pro to do a pro behavior. For me, that's a very fair way to go about it. And it takes the time it takes. I think that is something that we haven't touched on, and the dogs all learn at different rates.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually touched about rates of reinforcement there, and that's probably something that very few people know about rates of reinforcements. And so, anyway, for me, it's really working the dog where it is, and that they really learn at different levels. You have kindergartners, and then those kindergartners go into preschool, or preschool goes into grade school goes into what's after high school. High school, you go into college. College, you go into university. University, you go into PhD. So we're not being unfair with what we're asking. So I don't know how long we've been on, Jess, but
55 minutes.
Okay, so let's move on to this for a sec. Actually, I just want to address your mom for a sec, because she put a comment in, and for me, multi-dog households, I really like that. Again, because I have a multi-dog household, and for me, in this particular case, it's a very monkey see, monkey do. The Yorkie's learning socially through the older dog. If there is going to be an interrupter, and I think your mom said you got this pack thing where one dog barks and everybody barks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily be addressing everybody. I'd be addressing the guy who's not stopping. Like, I'd be addressing the dog
mm-hmm.
who's barking first
mm-hmm.
and setting everybody off.
Mm-hmm.
Because you address that dog and nobody else, assuming this is what the problem is, nobody else is going to go having a bark fest.
I had this yesterday in my house, just the same thing, like, because I've got the little yappy Boston Terrier, and she's triggered by weird things at night, because she has her own set of issues, and so at night, she's easily triggered, and it could be a tree, like something blew in the wind, and she went running to the window, and of course, all the other dogs jump up too, and they go to the window, and the coonhound's like, boo, boo. They have no idea. There's actually nothing there. And they have no idea, and it's like they're confused, but they're still engaging. So all I had to do was to call Zelda out, and the rest of them went, oh, okay. Well, there really wasn't anything. And so that's all I had to do, is get Zelda out of the equation.
Yeah, so I think that's an important aspect, because somebody with a multi-dog household is going to try to do what we're suggesting with both dogs in the equation. And for me, that's really going to be quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
If I was this guy, I would probably take the Yorkie out of the equation altogether for now, and just deal with that, with the bigger fluff butt, and get some parameters set around that.
Because I also think, though, if you're doing it the way that you were just describing, if we got that little fluffy guy out of the equation, if that guy engaged that first dog and said, okay, come on over here, that Yorkie would have followed them into another room.
Yeah, maybe.
Probably.
But
so we've got. Do you think
we have to try for sure?
There's another comment here. She's engaging you again. She says, "Do you think in a large pack society where all the levels are different, in some cases, with dogs who are a bit remedial, the pack itself cannot be involved in the training at the lower level dogs?" Yes, I mean, I would say, okay, so do you think in a large pack society where all the levels are different, the pack itself cannot be involved in the training of the lower level dogs?
I think that depends on the mastery you have of the higher level dogs.
Yeah. And I think this is a really great topic, and we probably should do another live about pack dynamics, like if you have multi-dog households. Multi-dog households are unique. It's not the same. It's just not the same as having a single dog household. It's just not. So I think that's something we can definitely discuss in more detail.
So was that your mom asking that question?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's another interesting question, and we could probably talk quite a bit about that. And your mom is probably fairly savvy in working with a pack of dogs. But the question also it begs another question, and that is, what are those higher level dogs doing?
Right.
And work the remedial dogs with them at the same time.
Right.
So you know what? There was something from the onset, Jess, that we spoke about about this particular behavior of these two dogs and what that could potentially lead to. Now, if we break this down, we have two dogs that are off leash, both being annoying, not necessarily super negative behavior in the sense that it's going to cause a problem per se. It's just kind of, for me anyway, is that when these dogs go through that household threshold, that's not going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're that much closer to the threat, to the stimulus. We're that much further over threshold. We're that much more going to be frustrated. Why? Because now we're going to be tethered to a guy that has no leadership skills and we don't trust. So we're going to take on, not only are we going to take on just the role of controlling the environment in the house, oh man, we're going to lose our crap when we go to being outside.
And I think that exactly what you were just describing, and we talked about it at the beginning, the risk of this behavior generalizing, globalizing, however you want to refer to it. The technical term is usually generalizing, but this behavior will likely get worse inside, generalize to other stimuli. So at first it might just be dogs, and then it might just be squirrels, and then it's going to be people with strollers, and then it might go over to cars, and now you can't have a guy with a bike drive by your house because the dog is barking at everything that moves. And then you actually might see it generalizing over to leaves falling from trees. So that part, it will generalize in that way. But the other part is, like you just said, now try going outside for a walk. It may have happened at first just in the front window. Now your dog's doing it in the backyard. Now you can't take your dog out for a leash walk. So I think that's the thing that we kind of, like, the precursor was like, this will and can and will get worse if you don't do anything about it.
And I think when we go into a house and go, well, we need to start within the house, people go, well, what do you mean? The problem is outside.
It's not.
My dog pulls on leash. Actually, that's the least of your worries. Because inside, we have to look at the structure of what the structure of the home looks inside, so that the dog feels calm, okay with you, and the dog is going out with you, not you're going together, not separate and only going. And the only thing that's keeping you together is this damn leash that is frustrating the hell out of the dog. And what most people are forgetting, in protection sports, they use, like with Malinois, Shepherds, Schnauzers, anything that does any protection sport.
To build drive. To build it.
To build drive, what do? You restrict. Why? Because restriction creates frustration.
Right.
And the frustration solicits a higher drive to get to that bite toy or that bite suit or whatever it is. So I think people are terribly confused about when they go out on leash and your dog's like, okay, let's look at that real quick. Back when they used to do protection sports in a particular way, I think they still do, they cause agitation by a leash. And the dog is straining on that leash. It's doing several things. One, it's crushing the carotid arteries, which is basically stopping blood flow to the brain, or slowing it down at least. And second, the dog is gasping for air, so the brain is not getting oxygen. Okay, The last time that I was underwater and I went too far or stayed down too long, and I suddenly found myself running out of breath, I can assure you my brain went into overdrive, my drive went up, and I wanted to get to the surface as fast as I possibly could.
Yeah.
And so you restrict air and blood to that brain, and that dog is looking at something particular that it wants to get to. Don't think that restraining it is doing you any favors, because that dog is just going to drive more towards that stimulus.
Well, and I think like we're digressing into now leash behaviors, but the same principle is happening behind a window.
Yeah.
Even though you're not restricting air and all of that stuff, you're still going, there's a thing there, and you get the same thing, which is like, hold me back, you know, like
Yeah.
that kind of mentality.
Yeah.
So, you know, you still get that. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so
Especially when you have a dog who's reacting against squirrels, any other sort of thing that it may conceive as maybe a predator or an intruder, because that dog is thinking, like at that window, like you said, hold me back. And in my mind, when I look at my protection, when I look at the protection dogs, those dogs aren't like, hold me back. They're like, I'm gonna kick your ass.
yeah,
I'm just gonna kick your ass. And then when they get that much closer, it's like, yeah, like it's that much closer to kicking their ass.
yeah,
And so the point to all of that, to that digression, was that behavior, this little annoying barky stuff, that's the crap that starts your shitty behaviors outside on walks, barking at everything,
yes.
pulling at everything, barking at biker, etc.
And I mean, we have another comment here that says like, okay, so what we're describing sounds like with the little Yorkie sounds like a risk of the OCD and seizure conditions that Poet's Vision talked about last time. And she's also saying, do you think that these dogs, or at least the little Yorkie, has a potential of creating those obsessive pathways? You're shaking your head. I absolutely think that you could turn this dog into a little obsessive, crazy monster. But more to the point with this dog, I think this dog so the thing about an OCD behavior is that it doesn't really have much of a purpose at the end of the day. This dog has purpose. So I'm not as concerned about this dog developing OCD behaviors because I think this dog wants to be effective. And that is that terrier nature. So I think the biggest risk with this dog is that it starts to learn that it can be effective in a number of ways. And that barking, then lunging, then growling, then biting, or any of those things can be effective. So that's what my concern would be with this dog. Less about a risk of them creating OCD behaviors, which at the end of the day are like a misfiring and don't necessarily have a purpose other like to affect the outside world. They don't really have a purpose to affect the outside world. This dog wants to be effective. That's what I see. I see this dog wants to be effective.
I think for me, just in this 2-minute video, I don't think that there is the potential for OCD. That's my personal opinion about it. There's missing too many other elements, I think, here for me to even go down the OCD stuff. And you know, Jess, I mean, it's a 2 or 3 minute video, and maybe the viewers are potentially asking themselves, well, how do you know? Experience. I mean, you can walk into a situation, Jess, and you can go, yep, this is beyond unruliness. This is beyond lack of structure. This is beyond lack of leadership. This is something. There's something a little. Help me. There's something a little not wrong.
Yes, it's something a little different.
Yeah, that's a good word. There's something a little off about that particular behavior.
Yeah.
That, like look at last week when you guys did Poet's Vision. Is it Tanya?
Yes.
I mean, when you sent me that video, I'm like, there's something
a little
here.
off.
And I don't know the dog. I haven't been with the dog, and all I saw was this brief video with this dog's
and you know what?
Putting dirt on his pee.
And this is the thing is, again, I go back to this. I really thought about, like, before we went on last week, I mean, I really, really got deep into the OCD behaviors. I went back to my textbooks. I was reading about them. And the big thing that I can say, the difference is those behaviors don't necessarily have a impact or a desire to impact the outside world. It's literally just about fulfilling some sort of impulse in their own mind. They're not even attempting anymore to have an actual effect on the outside world. This little dog in the video that we're watching now is. And I really don't see that dog going inside itself too much. I see this dog really wanting to affect something outside of itself. So that's why I wouldn't see this as a risk. And I honestly would be super excited if this client called me. If I walked in and saw this, I'd be like, we can fix this.
Yeah.
You can
I
fix
think,
this. You can
I think
change
so.
this.
I think that it takes some time to, in my estimation, it takes some time for a dog to create some OCD behaviors. And unless, and from what I'm saying, I'm framing this from sort of sound dogs, right? They have all their mental faculties about them. And I also think that there's sometimes may require some handler interaction. So, can you create a ball obsessed dog? Yeah, 100%. That's all the dog is fixated on, all day, every day. And that's from, for me, a repetitive motion of the same thing over and over and over. And the dog brings the ball and you launch it. The dog brings the ball and you launch it. The dog brings the ball and you launch it. For me, that has a potential of becoming an OCD. It's developed into that from a normal brain perspective because it's so repetitive. There's just, that's all they're doing.
Yeah, but Jay, I would say that dog,
no interruption.
It's super easy for that to happen, but the dog has to have already, and you can see it at 8 weeks because we assess puppies at 8 weeks. You see dogs who have the potential to be obsessive about an object.
Yeah.
And you can see it. So there are some dogs that try as you might, you will have a very difficult time developing that obsession. And then there are certain dogs that, because of how they're programmed, you don't have to try that hard and you could create an obsessive behavior. I have one.
Sure. And I can tell you that one was created in one of my shepherds. Because it wasn't like that. I assure you, it wasn't like that.
But that the dog's a shepherd.
Yes, right? But it doesn't matter. The dog is sound to begin with.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that but there's like little things inside those brains that you can unlock. And sometimes if you unlock it, and they're sitting there. So again, we're digressing, Jay. We keep doing this. We're going to get onto these other tangents.
So we're probably well over our 45-minute time frame.
Oh my God, we're at an hour and 12 minutes.
Okay, so I mean, maybe we can touch on one more thing. Because I don't know where you are, but where I am in the middle of nowhere, I see rain falling from the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll end. Well, look. There's also an important element here because we've touched on it a little bit, and it's not it's more than just the behaviors that we're seeing, but the input of the handler also influencing heavily what these dogs are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the input of the handler there, you can have really strong, subtle handler input that is very effective and communicative. And you can have very loud handler input that is absolutely meaningless. And I think that's developed over time with the dogs. But it would be a mistake for people to think that who they are and the way they go about things doesn't negatively or positively influence the end result.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are a person who has a protection dog, and you've got a massive chip on your shoulder where you are suspicious or of every person, like, what's that guy doing? I don't like that guy. I don't like this. I don't like that. Don't think that when you walk your dog's not going to pick up on that and go, you mean that guy? Yeah. And you're like, I want to kick his ass. And the dog's like, yeah, I want to kick his ass too. And
well,
so don't think that you as a handler don't have input in your dog's emotional response to something.
Okay, but further to that, Jay, it goes even further to that. You may not have had reactivity personally yourself as a human before you got that dog. And then the dog may have reacted once or twice, and it was enough for you now to have developed your own reactivity. So it's like a spiral, right? We always hear people say, "Oh, I know it's me. It's going down the leash and stuff like that," but it's so true. So what you're saying is so true. And what I'm pointing out is that you may not even have initially had that, but your dog may have reacted once or twice, and now you've claimed that, and it becomes now you're watching for dogs, and when you see a dog
Yeah.
over there, you get tensed up, your leash gets tense, and now you're not only are you triggering your dog, but you guys are now stuck in this mental state together, and that happens at the window too. I see it all
Yeah.
the time, and so I think it's really important. I think what you're talking about, owners, how owners affect how you respond to your dog, changes how they feel. How you respond to the stimuli changes how your dog feels. They need that leadership, which is taking them down that right path. And I've just had Christine just piped in and said she's got a dog who's quite difficult on leash, and she's saying I see that too, Jessica, because I know she's experienced this same thing where she didn't initially have nervousness, but because her dog reacted, and then it made her feel kind of insecure about her handling and how she would deal with the situation, she started triggering the dog because
Yeah.
of her own feelings about it. So it's really important what you're talking about is to self-assess.
Yeah. And a good visual picture for that is a dog who's reactive with its handler, and then we walk in and there's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
The dog is chill.
Or you take the end of the leash.
These little things. I mean, there's more to that equation. The dog doesn't know us. It's a honeymoon period. It's on its best behavior, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, that is such a confidence killer to the handlers, where they've gone through, maybe they've gone through training with other people, and the dog has been sort of sorted out. But then give the leash back to them, and the dog is doing the same thing. We walk in, we get called up, and suddenly we take the leash or whatever it is, and the dog is just walking calmly. And for me, that's indicative of several things, but most importantly, we aren't tensing up. We aren't anticipating a shitty behavior. And if a shitty behavior comes up, we are like, yeah, we'll deal with it. Like it's not the be all and end all.
Because we're becoming a stable force, and the dog starts to look to us for direction as opposed to accepting that we're going to follow it. So we've got another comment. The leash or the reins are equal to the strings between the two cans. The subtle emotions and energy travel freely in both directions. And so, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
100%. And this will also translate to the window.
Mm-hmm.
Like if people are who are struggling with this sort of behavior at their window currently in their home, if they're going at this and they're agitated, they're annoyed, or they go at it in too happy of a headspace, or
excitable.
They just go at it too happily. You could potentially create a more difficult situation in resolving this behavior. So,
and how you deal with it too, and so I just want to also say how you handle it is really important. So if you grab your dog's collar, again, we talked about restraint, making them want to go forward. How you handle that, how you move them away from that space, how you claim that space. And we talked a little bit before about body blocking, and we'll get more into that at some other point. But, claiming space and showing them without adding in that further drive to go forward. And so, so I will say that we didn't mention that yet, but I really do not recommend that you grab your dog's collar and pull them away from the window. I see people do that all the time.
Yeah, and that's a good way for a dog to take all of that energy and redirect it into something else, which is handler redirection.
Yeah.
So I think, Jess, like you said something interesting. You said a bunch of don'ts and a bunch of do's. Do body block. Do this. Do that. Don't grab your dog. Don't do this. Don't do that. And for me, from a conceptual perspective, it's what you're dealing with. You have to be in a very stable headspace.
Yeah, you've got to be thinking. Yeah, you got to be thinking.
Neutral. You got to be neutral to what's happening.
Yep.
You need to be in control of your emotions, because then you can think through stuff in a way that's going to be very effective, and not look at the dog losing its marbles, but think, how can I get this dog to respond to me effectively? And for me, being as calm and as assertive as your personality allows you to be is always the best approach.
And I just want to leave it on that on a note where, just to reinforce what you had said again, as emotions go up, intellect goes down. So if you want to be able to be a good leader for your dog, especially when your dog's emotions go up, your intellect needs to stay high. And I think that that's a really good way to end it, to think about it. And there's, both Coyote Canine and Pet Intel offer virtual services. So, if you are experiencing this type of behavior and it's getting to a point where you think you need professional help, both of our companies are capable of helping you virtually right now to navigate through that and to give you the details on how to work best with your specific dog. So so let's leave it at that, Jay. We're at 1 hour and 21 minutes. So it's a record. And our fellow geeks will laugh at us because they know that when Jay and I get together, we tend to chat quite a bit. So the last comment, the trick is to see the balance, the energy, by matching it in its opposite direction. So keeping that pendulum, being a guiding force. So be a guiding force for your dog. Take a deep breath, and if you can't teach, manage, right?
You bet.
All right. Okay. So we'll see you guys on Tuesday. We're going to have a special guest on Tuesday at 7:30. We're going to be on Tuesday on the Geeks. Nicole LaPrat-Petrie from Pet Intel is going to be joining us. Yes, we're going to be doing a special segment on kids and dogs. And so we are going to have a special guest, and we will see you Tuesday.
You bet.
All right. Thanks, everybody.